Good morning, Cindy.
Good morning, Dennis.
Well, we promised our listeners that we were going to talk about this, and the day is finally here for all those helicopter parents out there, and I'm included in one. So I know that's not a clinical term; it's something that we just use to kind of make
Yes.
ourselves. But with all that said, I think it's timely too because we've talked about perspectives of parents when they take their children to school, what it's like for the kids, what it's like for the parents, and both sides of that. And now I thought this would be a logical conclusion, but also a great discussion with you to talk about the helicopter parent generation. So I kind of in my head know what that is, but maybe from somebody who's got a degree when it comes to working with families and one-on-one counseling and children, teens, adolescents, and the whole dynamics of the world that we live in. And I know you're a parent too. What exactly is as you see it, a helicopter parent?
So we're talking about parents that are extremely involved with their children at all levels. And we're talking about uh, the notion that developmentally children need to take more and more agency in their own lives as they get older, and that sometimes parents continue to be very involved with their children in places when perhaps those children need to be taking more responsibility themselves.
I'm going to ask you the obvious question. Where does this stem from? Why do we act this way as parents? And then when I say that, I'm talking in general terms because I know every family is a little bit different.
Right. I mean, some of it, of course, comes from our own background. What we see in this generation is we see a much more involved group of parents. Of course, not everyone, but there seems to be a trend in the more involved parent generation than the previous generation. And, the previous generation or the previous couple of generations are generations in which parents kind of sat back and kids figured many things out on their own. And I think some people who are now parents are hoping to kind of swing the other direction and be more available to their children in ways that perhaps they didn't feel their parent was available to them. I guess that's one way I would understand it.
That makes a lot of sense. And if we could have a little fun, I'm going to psychoanalyze myself along with my wife
Okay.
who's not here to speak for herself. But, that makes a lot of sense. I think that it is human nature as a parent to want to do better for your child than the upbringing that you had. Okay. So that's a natural tendency, I think, for most of us out there. With all that said, I've also thought, well, we're in a more complicated world, the internet, social media. And I think it's made parents today hyper aware of all the dangers that are out there for their children. But there's got to be something else that maybe we can discuss when it comes to that, because we only had the one child, and I know you're in the same boat as I am with only having the one child. So there's a polarization there. There's no doubt about that. If you have multiple children, I think we can all agree that the children kind of police themselves a little bit when you have 2, 3, and 4 kids in a family, and it's a whole different dynamic. But coming from us, we were a tripod. We were very close. We still are to this day, all three of us, my daughter, my wife, and myself. And there seems to be an intimacy, and I'm speaking now from my daughter's perspective. And I've had this conversation with my wife for many years that she knows too much about us. And I think I know you know what that means, but she's so close to us, so involved in our lives that there is not that separation, and I'll for a lack of a better phrase, of church and state, the parents and the children, where there used to be in the old days when I grew up as a 70s kid, to where there are today. Now, I didn't necessarily fight back against this kind of parenting that I did over the last 20 years with my daughter, but it seemed inevitable. So maybe you could get into that a little bit about, why we took the mantle and took it to the next level as parents.
I would go back to what I was saying a minute ago, that I think it's not uncommon when it comes to parenting to swing to the other pole. You either identify with the way you were raised, and that often has something to do with how you felt about the way you were raised, and or you might go to the other pole and do the opposite. So in the places where maybe people feel disappointed with the way that they were raised, they want to do something else. And they want to breed more intimacy in their relationships with their children. And to that end, sometimes there aren't as many boundaries between generations in the service of more closeness.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think the one thing for me is boundaries. And once again, I want to be very clear that we're super close with our daughter, but there seems to be boundaries that probably my parents had. In fact, I know they did with me. as opposed to me with my daughter. Some of that I embrace. I mean, I have a very close relationship. We love each other a lot, and we know each other a lot, but sometimes those boundaries get crossed regularly, and that's where it starts to be a little bit disconcerting for a parent. And maybe you could address this once that horse is out of the barn. It seems to you can't stop it at that point, and there's a lot of inevitabilities that go with that. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit, about maybe some of the things that we can do, because I know there's going to be parents that have preteens here that are getting to that point where their kid's going to be out in the great wide open a little bit more with high school, but still they're so involved in each other's lives that helicopter thing is a continuous motion and they can't stop it.
Well, and I want to be careful here not to necessarily pathologize what parents are doing today, because there's a little bit of an undertone in what we're saying so far, like this is a bad thing.
Right.
Look, in many cases, it's not a bad thing. There are many benefits to parents being involved with their children. And even the notion of a helicopter parent, really kind of speaks to it being a bad thing. And so I sort of hesitate to sign on to that description. I think parents are more involved. That's a statement that we're making. And sometimes that means there are less boundaries between parents and children. And so then we kind of want to think about, well, what's working here and what's not working? And in the places it's not working, what do we need to do about that? Right. And
Yeah.
so and I'll talk more about this, but here's a place that's very important that I think parents well understand now that I don't think previous generations understood because it wasn't known as well. Teens do not get their frontal lobe on board, their wise mind that helps them make good decisions until they are 25 years old.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up.
25. So if you're 25 before you really can think clearly and make good decisions on your own, then those teen years are challenging years where parents probably do need to intervene on some kind of regular basis and do some fact checking and reality checking. Who, what, where, when, why, how aren't bad questions for parents to be asking their teens. And, people know their children, and some kids, run with a faster group and they're maybe more impulsive. Other kids, they don't have to worry about. And those things all matter too. If you know your child to be on the more immature side, then you probably are going to want to do that who, what, where, when, why, how question and answer kind of series. And kids that you know to be very responsible, kids that are, do all the right things, we don't have to worry as much because we kind of know where they are and that can be trusted. So it's actually a very complicated issue, what we're talking about there. This is not a simple thing. Understanding what are the right boundaries, some of it is very individual. What's good for one child may not be at all good for another child.
Yeah, I agree that I think everything is relative and it's case by case for every family. By the way, just for the record, Cindy, even though you mentioned the year 25 for the frontal lobe full development, I'm in my 50s and my wife has suggested that my frontal lobe still has not developed correctly and to its full maximum potential. I don't know about your husband, but my wife has suggested that with me. So I want to get that out. Well, I want to talk about something else. And once again, I'm going to use my own experiences and I'm going to get very specific about this. So with us having our only child, we usually never lift a finger for anything, whether she needed, dinner, food, snack, she forgot something, we took it to school. I could go on and on about all that. But we realized when she was getting around the 11th grade, even though she did a little bit of cooking and a little bit of cleaning, we started to get in panic mode that, hey, when she goes off to college in the next year, she's not going to be self-sufficient. And that was really a big worry from us. And once again, what we didn't realize what we were doing as we were taking care of her, all her needs, and quite happily too. And I'm glad you brought up about the negative connotation about helicopter parenting, because I think there's a lot of positive things of the closeness to your child. But we realized that if we didn't let her start doing things for her own and say a couple of no's, you can do that, we were going to put her in harm's way at her next level of adulting in college, when she has to cook for herself. She has to clean for herself. She has to check on her schedules and basically adult. And I guess that's our worry. So we did it a little bit more abruptly. We just kind of said, all right, you're doing it for yourself. And we didn't kind of glide into it. And she noticed it right away and said, hey, what's up, parents? And so it's not that she fought back, but she was so used to the coddling and all the nice things we were doing that we would still happily do today. But we got into a danger zone where we worried a little bit. Geez, we better get our acts together to let our daughter be able to take care of herself, and that's something that we had discussed, and it kind of hit us, like a frying pan, and kind of scared us for a second. All we did up until the 11th grade, and saying we need to start saying no, or in a very nice way, you can do that for yourself, or I'm going to teach you how to do this, which we did too. Maybe you can address that.
I think what you're saying is so important because there are some things that are individual differences. There are other things that are a given for all children. Children have to grow up. When and how they do that can vary, but everybody has to grow up and learn how to take care of themselves. That has to do with money management. That has to do with household responsibilities. That has to do with self-care. That has to do with engagement with other people. There are many levels that are required here. Cooking, cleaning, like you're bringing up those examples. If children are children that are able to grow up and be independent and live on their own, there's a whole host of things they need to learn. And somewhere in the teen years, it's not a bad time to start working on those things, because then when you go out into the world, you're much better prepared to handle things. Going off to summer camp. I'm always in favor of people sending their kids to camp if they can afford it, even
Right.
if it's a short time, even if it's only a week. These opportunities for kids to really not have parents around involved, but it's their responsibility to do everything.
I think that's the one thing, and I don't know if you want to use any of your examples as a parent, but I once again, I'm an open book, so I will exactly tell you how I felt about it. That when we were getting to that point of going off to college, and we've addressed this in other shows with you, of the run of emotions that you go through as a parent, that you've had this person in your house, your child, for 18 years, and now abruptly they're off, and they could be 100 miles away, they could be 3,000 miles away. It really doesn't matter. It's shocking to the system. With all that said, we've also talked about the children too, and what they're experiencing. I'm just wondering, from your standpoint, about expectations from both, as you've done this as that helicopter parent and met all the needs, and then being able to release the child, because to your point, they're going to have to adult. They're going to have to learn sooner than later so they can survive out there in a very rough world when it comes to the simple things like cooking and cleaning that we talked about, but also, how do you vote, and how do you do this, and how do you do that, and how do I make a doctor's appointment? And I see jokes on TikTok all the time of somebody that looks of 25 or 30 about them calling their mom about, hey, how do I book this appointment for the doctor again? What's my social security number?
Right.
And I think that because of all that coddling and all the favors we've done our children, because of the love we have for them, that we've missed out opportunities to adult a little bit earlier than we should have. And that's a trap we fall into, that I just told you that story about the 11th grade, that we finally got our act together about cooking and cleaning and some simple things out there. But I imagine that this happens to a lot of parents. And is it conscious? Is it unconscious? Is it a compilation of both? Why are we doing those kind of things?
I think that many people perhaps felt, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, of course,
Sure,
but
sure.
that I do think there's a generation of people that felt like they were too much out there on their own, and
Yeah.
they're trying to compensate for that.
Right, right.
And they felt like they were so ill prepared to go off to college, to get their first job, all those things. So these people are now dotting the I and crossing the T for their child, so as the child not to feel so alone. But there's a cost to doing that, is the problem, because some of those things that we, look at and say, gee, where were the parents? Why weren't they more helpful? Well, it turns out that their attitudes were believing in the child in one way, and believing that the child is resilient and can figure things out, and that they need to. And whether those parents were conscious of this, or whether it was just a sort of sign of the times, I'm not sure, but it was true that that led to a pretty resilient generation, a more mature, more adult generation much earlier. What we see now is that people in their early to mid 20s, they're still sort of pseudo adolescents
Hmm.
because they have been guided and supported so much. And what you also see is that it's not uncommon. I hear this so often from people when their child goes off to college, they get there and sometimes they have a meltdown because they're not prepared and they don't know how to really fly solo. And so you're really not doing your kids a favor when you don't give them that information and step back and trust that they can figure it out. You
And
know,
that's
that they need
yeah,
your trust, that
yeah.
you believe they can figure it out.
And
And
that's the
so
hard part of doing that. It really was. I could speak once again from personal experience. That's hard to do, but it's an interesting dichotomy. And I'm glad you brought up about all these things about how we grew up and how they grew up. And I kind of was of two minds and I didn't realize I was doing it both. And I'll explain. So I'm a 70s kid. So I was released out into the wild, came home on my bike when it got dark, street lamps are on, dinner was ready to go.
yeah,
Didn't know what my parents did, didn't know their politics. The church and state certainly separated. So while I overcompensated for maybe being alone like I was, I don't have any ill will to my parents, or I don't feel negative about being released out to the wild and taking care of myself, or fending for myself of putting all my college stuff together and going out on my own, getting jobs and not relying on my parents, all those things. And then I found myself, as I found out about those boundaries with my daughter, that I was getting a little mad at times by, why can't she get her act together and take care of herself like
right,
I did? Yet
right,
I'm catching myself also being that
right.
helicopter parent. So you can see I was getting mad about something, but I was also feeding the monster at the same time, not realizing it was happening.
That is such a common pattern. Parents are wondering, get it together. What's the
Yeah.
problem? I got it together.
Yeah.
And you're comparing your insides to their outsides. I mean, they can't, they're no more prepared for that. How would they be prepared for that? They haven't had any experience of that. And it really is quite a set of skills to stand back. And then as they get to be adults, of course, you have to stand back even more. And that'll be another good conversation for us, one that's not often spoken of, but the role of the parent of their adult children is another really hard topic. So, but even the beginning process of your biggest thing is now it's time for you to begin to release them. They need to be released into the wild, as you put it, Dennis. They need that opportunity. They need the opportunity to realize the ground is solid underneath them, that they are resilient, that they can manage things. I'd rather that they stumble while at home than go out in the world and stumble for the first time.
Agreed. Yeah.
And that's a really important part because then when you do go out into the world, you're like, oh, yeah, I've stumbled before. I can handle this. And that's where college is a great kind of testing zone because when you go to college, there are things provided, like some people have a meal plan or some people have a place to live. Not everyone, of course, it's very different. Some people live at home, some people bring their lunch, depending on what the economic situation is. But there are often situations where there are many things provided, but not everything's provided.
Right. Right.
And so it's the beginning of that process. So it's a great opportunity for parents to just gently let themselves sit back and enjoy the show. You know, this is their show. It won't always be a pleasant show. You'll be getting some crying phone calls, I promise, but they'll get through it and they'll feel better and they'll feel proud. And by the time they come home at Thanksgiving, oh boy, will they have stories to tell you.
Will they
And then
ever?
you can just clap for them and be so excited about all they're learning about, not just school, but life.
Right. We've established that both of us have only children, so that's our dynamic. And I know that it's different and case by case, but are there inherent differences that are really allowed from multiple children families when it comes to the helicopter parent generation, as opposed to with you and I having an only child?
I Yes, I do see that. I mean, the more children, the less attention from the parents. So the notion of a helicopter parent, unless the parent is like AAA personality style, it's just much harder to have all hands on deck for all children. So by definition, they're not going to be as engaged. And there are positives and negatives to that. They're not going to get involved in some of the negative pieces of being very involved. But by the same token, some children in larger families can feel a bit neglected. And it's benign neglect. Nobody means harm, but you just
Right.
literally don't have as much time to connect with each child in the family. And the larger the family, the more that's true.
You know, what's also interesting too that I wanted to share with you, and I realize that when you're a certain tribe, you glommer onto tribes like yours. So a lot of my friends in our friend group married late in life, like I did with my wife, and also had children late in life, and they only had one kid. So we had a lot of similarities there. So we caught ourselves kind of doing that same thing. And I wonder, and once again, we're just talking in relative terms, but if you're an older parent with only one child, does that make a difference of being a quote helicopter parent at all?
I can't help but think that it would, because you truly are, you know, probably at least one generation more removed from your child.
Right.
So your understanding of the world is a little bit more challenged. And your sensibilities about things are just going to be different based on where you come from. So there's more of a gap to bridge. When they talk about the generation gap, there's more generation to fill, there's more gap to fill. And so sometimes that can lead those parents to become even more involved, because they can sense that kind of vulnerability that they feel about, gosh, I want to stay connected to my kid. How do I do it? I'm going to start painting my toenails blue, or I'm going to start listening to that music, or I'm going to, trying to find ways to bridge the gap.
So, Sydney, you've had a chance to meet all sorts of different people in your practice with families and one-on-one and children and teens and preteens and adults and parents and, broken up marriages. There's a whole cavalcade of people that you had an opportunity to talk to. When it comes generationally, we've got the baby boomers, and I was at the end of the baby boom and the Generation X. I was born in 64, so I'm 58. So with that said, then, you got the Generation Z and so forth and so on. Is this a blip when it comes to parental behavior, or because of the very complex world that we live in today, is the helicopter parent, once again, in relative terms, here to stay?
I think it's here to stay. I really do, because we're just dealing with so much now.
Mm.
And, there's always this debate about, is it worse now than it used to be, like during the Vietnam War or World
Right.
War II, or, is it any worse? I think it is. I think we're just I think that the gravity of so many issues happening all at once make people feel protective of their children at a different level. And I think when you feel protective, you lean in to protect. And that means being more involved. I think parents are more frightened to let go of their children now than they've ever been.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to make gross generalizations, but I see a trend in that direction with the parents that I'm talking to, that they're very much affected and aware of what's going on in the world around them and how their children are going to be affected by that. I could list all the current things going on. I don't think I need to. There are many of them, and
Yeah.
parents are very aware of that and very aware of the impact on their children.
I think another topic that you and I can discuss down the road is the effect on social media and families, because once again, what I do for a living, social media is a part of my life. So I know how to use it. I look out for the pitfalls, careful about it. When it first came around, though, I fell into some traps too as a on-air person, and getting feedback and criticism, and how nasty and fiery social media can get. But that's just another complicated thing that you add on to the helicopter generation that I believe has to do a lot, because we have so much access to the internet and social media. We see the pitfalls as adults, and our children insist on being a part of it. So you have to decide, well, when is that going to be? When are you going to get a phone? When are you going to get on social media? How long can I follow you for? Da, 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 da. It goes on and on and on. But I think that scares the living heck out of parents and complicates this helicopter thing, good or bad, that we see so much out there and want the best for our children, but we know we're going to be a part of this crazy world. I think that's where, once again, we overmanage and get too much into their lives because of social media, the internet, and the complexities. And I imagine that's part of your conversations with some families at times.
Absolutely. Well, trying to be deliberate about it, not just, this is a place where I think it kind of runs the other direction where, social media is just kind of wreaking havoc with everything. And so sometimes parents aren't deliberate enough about, okay, how much screen time have you had and of what sort? And what sites are you on? And how can I manage that and supervise you better? I mean, social media just kind of took off like wildfire. And I think that's another way that when you ask about older parents, a lot of older parents, you're in the media world, so you know very much about it, but a lot of parents don't. And they don't know about putting blocks on phones or on televisions or on computers. And so kids are getting exposed to a lot of stuff. And that's the kind of other end of what's been happening. And so it's kind of taking over a life of its own, some of these social media issues and the impact on children and the things that children are exposed to that they're not really that ready to receive or do anything with. I mean,
We,
do anything useful with. They don't
right,
have kind of capacity to know how to manage some of what they're witnessing.
right. We talked a little bit about the abruptness that I had with saying, oh my gosh, we better let our daughter start doing some things or she's not going to fend for herself out in the wild, especially when she goes to college. What's happening in the kid's mind when that happens? How are they reacting?
I think they're like, what the heck is going on? You mean when parents say, okay,
How
now
dare
it's
you?
time for you to do your own laundry and you're
Yeah,
responsible for making one meal a week. And here's your checkbook, start budgeting and doing your bookkeeping,
right.
right? What are they thinking? They're thinking, what's going on? I liked what we had going before. And
And
I've
I,
had more than 120 something come in and say, why would I move out of my parents' house? I
right.
get meals cooked. I get my laundry done. I
Yeah.
have a lovely room. There's a housekeeper who comes. I mean, again, this is one
Yeah.
subset of society, but even
Sure.
people that don't have all that, you know, parents, whether it's a single parent home or, two parents, when you live in someone's home of whatever sort it is, apartment, house, townhouse, whatever, somebody's taking care of you. And so
Yeah.
that's the other part of it. Then you find these, bounce back kids who leave college, come home, and it's very hard for them to want to get out of that environment. And it doesn't, they don't feel any sense of, well, I don't want to be here. I want my own life. They don't feel that feeling.
And there's a lot of that, isn't there, going on right now?
Absolutely, especially in the younger generations. My daughter, who's about to turn 27, she absolutely was not planning to come home. She absolutely wanted her own job. So
Yeah.
she seems to still be in that group that, has that sense of their own feeling of autonomy and wanting separateness. But a lot of these younger kids, and I think partly as a side effect of the way that the parents have been so involved, they don't have that sense.
Right.
Now, having said all this, I would also say our financial situation in this country is changing, and it's not that uncommon for parents and younger children and even grandchildren to all live in the same home now. And we are changing the structure of what family means. And that may not be a bad thing. That may be a good and necessary thing that children and parents and grandparents can all live together and support one another. So then we have to get even more sophisticated about how do we think about what does it mean to grow up? And I hear a lot of conversations and everything I just said that I can imagine us talking about in the future.
Yeah, I can too. Listen, we only have about 30 seconds left, but advice for parents that are maybe having a kid that is getting through preteen and they've been spoiled and they don't want to be helicopter parents, but they find themselves coddling their children. What advice do you have for parents out there?
Trust your children. They can figure it out. You're going to be there to help them, no doubt of that. Know that these questions you have are really important questions to be asking. And some of the kinds of things you are concerned about as a dentist, as a parent dentist, all parents need to be concerned about, which is my kid's going to go out on their own. They better know how to do their laundry and do their bookkeeping, manage their budget, cook. You know, they need to be able to get out in the world and manage themselves safely. And so you do really want to think actively about these things and be deliberate about how you intervene with your children. I guess that's I would I would be planful and clear and deliberate about how you want to respond to your children.
I think that's well stated, Cindy. And my final advice is sometimes it's okay to say no as a parent, folks. It's hard, but sometimes if you say no and let them do it for themselves, you're going to win in the end. But it's a tough.
Absolutely. Yes,
Tough.
that is such an important thing you just said. No is a good answer. Stepping back can be a really good position to take.
Right. Cindy, as always, thank you so much for your time. In our conversations, we always have so much that we're going to talk about in the future, and we will do that periodically with you all through the year and next year. But thank you so much again for your time. We really appreciate it and joining us on Community DC. Thanks so much.
And if people want to reach me, they can reach out at cynthiapostphd.com.
Outstanding. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. This was great.